Albert Camus' legacy is often misunderstood because it does not take the form people expect. He did not leave behind a system, a school, or a doctrine that can be easily inherited. There is no Camusian method in the way there is a Marxist, Freudian, or Sartrean one. Camus left something more difficult and less portable, a moral stance. His legacy is not a set of answers, but a way of refusing certain answers, even when they are tempting, fashionable, or historically powerful. Camus' work survives not because it resolves the problems of modern life, but because it refuses to lie about them. In an age obsessed with explanation, Camus insists on clarity. In an age drawn to certainty, he insists on limits. In an age willing to justify cruelty in the name of necessity, he insists on responsibility without appeal. This refusal is the core of his legacy. Camus lived through a century that promised meaning through history. Ideologies claimed that suffering could be redeemed by future justice, that violence could be excused by progress, and that individual lives could be sacrificed for collective ends. Camus rejected these promises, not because he was indifferent to injustice, but because he believed that justice purchased through abstraction is no justice at all. What Camus leaves behind is a sustained resistance to moral shortcuts. He refuses the idea that meaninglessness permits nihilism. He refuses the idea that injustice permits murder. He refuses the idea that history absolves the present. In doing so, he preserves a space for judgment that modern thought repeatedly tries to erase. Camus' legacy begins with the absurd. The absurd is not despair, and it is not rebellion for its own sake. It is the honest recognition that the world does not answer our demand for meaning. Camus does not soften this recognition. He insists that it be faced directly, without consolation and without escape. What makes this recognition enduring is that it has not become obsolete. If anything, it has become more widespread. Modern life confronts individuals with randomness, injustice, and contingency on a scale Camus could not have imagined. The absurd is no longer a philosophical discovery, it is an everyday condition. Camus's legacy lies in how he responds to this condition. He refuses suicide not because life is guaranteed to be meaningful, but because abandoning life resolves nothing. Suicide, for Camus, is a confession that the absurd cannot be lived with. His refusal affirms that life can be endured without justification. This refusal establishes the foundation of his moral thought. To live without appeal is to accept that no external authority will redeem one's actions. Responsibility remains with the individual. There is no God to judge, no history to absolve, no ideology to excuse. What one does matters precisely because nothing guarantees it will be right. Camus' legacy is therefore inseparable from responsibility. Responsibility for Camus is not obedience to rules or alignment with causes. It is vigilance. It is the refusal to allow explanation to replace judgment. It is the discipline of remaining aware of the human cost of one's actions, even when those actions are praised or demanded. This discipline becomes most visible in Camus's insistence on limits. Camus is one of the rare modern thinkers who argues that moral strength lies in restraint rather than expansion. He insists that not everything that can be done should be done, and not everything that is effective is therefore justified. In a century defined by total solutions, Camus insists on partial resistance. He does not believe the world can be fixed. He believes it can be made less cruel. This modesty is not resignation, it is realism. It refuses the fantasy that suffering can be eliminated through force without creating new suffering in the process. Camus' distinction between revolt and revolution is central to this legacy. Revolt begins as a protest against injustice. It says no to humiliation and affirms human dignity. Revolution, when it abandons limits, transforms that refusal into a claim of absolute authority. When revolt becomes total, it ceases to defend humanity and begins to remake it. Camus' legacy is the insistence that revolt must remain faithful to its origin. Once revolt justifies murder, it betrays the value that gave rise to it. This insight remains relevant because the temptation to absolutize revolt has not disappeared. It has simply changed language. Camus' work also leaves behind a warning about intellectual responsibility. Camus understood that violence does not begin with weapons, it begins with language. It begins when suffering is framed as necessary, when victims are reduced to numbers, and when cruelty is justified by theory. Intellectuals, Camus believed, are responsible not only for what they say, but for the moral climate their words create. This is why Camus refuses to excuse violence through explanation. One may understand why violence occurs without declaring it legitimate. When explanation becomes justification, ethics collapses into description. Camus' legacy is the insistence that this collapse be resisted. Camus paid a price for this insistence. He was isolated politically and intellectually. He did not belong comfortably to any camp. The right distrusted him for condemning injustice. The left despised him for refusing to sanctify violence. Camus accepted this isolation because he believed belonging purchased through moral compromise was too expensive. This willingness to remain isolated is itself part of his legacy. Camus demonstrates that integrity may require solitude and that popularity is a poor measure of moral seriousness. He does not romanticize isolation, but he does not flee from it either. Despite this severity, Camus' legacy is not bleak. It is grounded in solidarity. Because there is no higher meaning, human beings become each other's only measure. Because there is no guaranteed justice, we become responsible for limiting injustice ourselves. Camus' humanism is not sentimental, it is disciplined. This discipline rejects both despair and fanaticism. Despair abandons responsibility by declaring action pointless. Fanaticism abandons responsibility by declaring action necessary at any cost. Camus occupies the narrow space between them, where action is possible but never absolute. Camus' legacy endures because this space has not closed. Modern life continues to push individuals toward resignation or extremism. Camus continues to insist on something harder: clarity without consolation, revolt without murder, responsibility without appeal. What Camus leaves behind is not a conclusion, but a posture. Remain awake. Refuse alibis. Draw limits. Do not trade conscience for belonging. Do not allow necessity to erase guilt. Do not let abstraction replace the human being. This is not a comforting legacy. It does not promise success or redemption. It promises only that one can live without betraying oneself. That promise, fragile and demanding, is why Camus still matters, and why his legacy has not faded with time. What remains is how that legacy confronts the world after Camus himself is gone. If the first part of Camus' legacy is the moral posture he maintained during his life, the second is how that posture continues to resist appropriation after his death. Camus is unusually difficult to inherit. He offers no doctrine that can be repeated mechanically, no slogans that can be mobilized, no program that can be implemented without judgment. This resistance to inheritance is not accidental. It is the final expression of his thought. Many thinkers are preserved by being simplified. Their ideas are reduced to slogans that can circulate without friction. Camus resists this fate because his work does not tell people what to think. It tells them what not to excuse. His legacy does not offer comfort. It demands restraint. It insists on limits in a world that constantly seeks permission to cross them. This is why Camus is frequently misunderstood. He is often portrayed as a humanist without politics, a moralist without realism, or a thinker frozen in mid-century concerns. But Camus's relevance does not depend on historical specificity. It depends on structure. The moral temptations he resisted, absolutism, justification, abstraction, have not disappeared. They have become more sophisticated. In contemporary life, Camus' warnings apply not only to states and ideologies, but to systems that did not exist in his time. Technology promises efficiency without accountability. Bureaucracy promises neutrality without responsibility. Algorithms make decisions that no one claims ownership of. In each case, harm is presented as impersonal, unavoidable, or optimized. Responsibility dissolves into process. Camus' legacy confronts this logic directly. He insists that responsibility cannot be automated, delegated, or anonymized. Even when decisions are distributed across systems, individuals remain responsible for sustaining them. The absence of a single guilty agent does not eliminate guilt, it disperses it. This insistence is increasingly uncomfortable. Modern life prefers explanations that remove moral weight. Structural causes are invoked not only to understand harm, but to excuse it. Camus never denies the importance of structure. He denies that structure absolves. One can acknowledge systemic forces without surrendering judgment. This is why Camus continues to matter in debates about power. He does not deny that power exists. He denies that power legitimizes itself. No amount of efficiency, legality, or historical success transforms domination into justice. Camus's refusal to confuse force with right remains one of his most enduring contributions. Camus's legacy is also marked by his refusal to be claimed entirely by any political tradition. Attempts are often made to recruit him posthumously, to present him as a liberal, a conservative, a centrist, or a moderate. All of these attempts fail because Camus does not fit the logic of alignment. He does not begin from ideology and derive ethics. He begins from ethics and judges ideology. This inversion is essential. It means that Camus cannot be used without being distorted. His work functions less as a resource than as a test. It asks whether a position can survive without moral shortcuts. If it cannot, Camus exposes the failure. This testing function explains why Camus remains unsettling. He does not flatter modern sensibilities. He does not reassure us that we are already right. He insists that sincerity does not equal innocence, and that good intentions do not erase harm. Responsibility for Camus does not end at motivation. Another aspect of Camus' legacy is his rejection of historical consolation. Many thinkers comfort themselves with the belief that future generations will understand, redeem, or justify present suffering. Camus refuses this belief. The dead cannot be compensated by the future. Injustice does not become acceptable because it contributed to progress. This refusal is particularly relevant in an age that constantly appeals to the long term. Climate, economics, and geopolitics are framed in temporal abstractions that distance action from consequence. Camus insists that responsibility remains rooted in the present. One must answer now for what one permits now. Camus's legacy also survives in his insistence on human scale. He distrusts grand narratives not because they are false in every detail, but because they flatten experience. They obscure faces. They transform suffering into data. Camus continually pulls attention back to the individual, not as an abstraction, but as a living body subject to harm. This insistence is why Camus' work continues to resonate in literature as much as philosophy. His novels do not argue, they show. They place individuals in situations where explanation is available but insufficient. The reader is forced to confront responsibility without guidance. Camus' death at a young age has sometimes encouraged a sentimental reading of his legacy, as though his thought represents an unfinished promise. This is misleading. Camus' work is complete in its incompleteness. He never intended to arrive at a final synthesis. His refusal of closure is itself the conclusion. What Camus leaves behind is not a theory that evolves, but a discipline that must be practiced. Each generation must decide whether to accept limits, whether to resist justification, whether to remain awake to the cost of its actions. Camus offers no guarantee that this discipline will prevail. He offers only the possibility that it can be chosen. This is why Camus's legacy is fragile. It cannot be institutionalized without being betrayed. It cannot be enforced without contradiction. It survives only where individuals are willing to accept responsibility without appeal. Yet this fragility is also its strength, because it cannot be owned, it cannot be exhausted, because it resists certainty, it resists obsolescence. Camus remains relevant not because he predicted the future, but because he understood the structure of moral temptation. In every era, there are forces that promise redemption through force, certainty through exclusion, and meaning through domination. Camus' legacy stands as a refusal of these promises. It does not defeat them, it resists them. Resistance for Camus is not heroic, it is ordinary. It is the daily refusal to excuse what one would condemn if done by others. It is the discipline of judging one's own side as rigorously as one judges opponents. It is the willingness to accept solitude rather than participate in cruelty. Camus understood that this stance would never be popular. Popularity rewards reassurance, not restraint. Camus' legacy survives not in mass movements, but in individuals who refuse to trade conscience for belonging. In the end, Camus leaves us without comfort but not without direction. He does not tell us how history will end. He tells us how not to behave while it unfolds. He does not offer salvation, he offers integrity. This is why Camus' legacy has not faded. As long as human beings continue to justify harm in the name of necessity, his refusal remains relevant. As long as abstraction threatens to erase the human being, his insistence on limits remains necessary. Camus does not solve the problem of evil. He insists that we not become its agents while pretending to oppose it. That insistence is his legacy, and it is still unfinished, because it must be chosen again by others in conditions he could never have imagined.